I've always believed that the most dangerous people in business aren't the loud ones. It's the ones who think they're the smartest in the room, without ever checking who's actually in it. My name is Linda. I've worked at Colburn Tech for 8 years, long enough to survive 2 restructurings, 3 failed product launches, and a global crisis. I'm not flashy. I don't throw around titles. But I know this company better than anyone else on the 12th floor. What most people didn't know, including my new boss, was that I was also the silent investor who helped keep the company afloat during its darkest year. Back then, when our CEO begged for emergency funding to avoid a hostile takeover, I stepped up quietly, using the inheritance my grandmother left me. In exchange, I became the majority shareholder, but I never told anyone, not even my closest colleagues. My name appeared on paper in a holding firm registered out of state. No spotlight, no ego. I just wanted the company to survive. And then he arrived. Jacob Moore, newly appointed Executive Director of Operations, tall, polished, MBA from Stanford, all charm and spreadsheets. He introduced himself to the team like a motivational speaker. "Change is coming," he said, his grin almost too white. "We're going to take this company to the next level." At first, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. Change wasn't always bad, but it became clear very quickly that Jacob wasn't here to lead. He was here to conquer. He started making cuts, first to the admin team, then to product development. People who had worked here for a decade were suddenly no longer aligned with the company's vision. And in every team meeting, Jacob managed to make himself the hero. He loved the sound of his own voice so much that I started keeping tally of how many times he said, "Let me simplify this for you." By week 3, he still hadn't asked me a single question about my role. I had built the analytics division from scratch, developed the tools that saved us over $2 million in losses last year, and led the most successful client migration in company history. None of that mattered to Jacob. To him, I was just another name on an org chart. One Thursday morning, I was sitting at my desk reviewing data models when his assistant came in. "Jacob would like to see you in conference room B now." No context. No explanation. I gathered my laptop and walked down the corridor, my heels clicking against the marble tile, the silence around me unusually heavy. When I walked into the room, Jacob was already seated at the head of the table, arms folded. The blinds were drawn, the lights too bright. "Linda," he said without looking up, "let's keep this brief." I sat down, calm but alert. He finally looked up. "I've been reviewing your department's output. Frankly, I'm not impressed. The tools you've built are outdated and your team seems to lack initiative." I blinked once. "Outdated according to..." He shrugged. "Industry standards, metrics, gut instinct, doesn't matter. Bottom line is we're streamlining. And I think you've plateaued." There was a pause. Then he leaned forward and said it. "You're replaceable. You add nothing here." The words didn't sting, not the way he probably expected. Instead, something in me cracked, like a dam that had been quietly holding back water for far too long. I let out a short, sharp laugh. He frowned. "I'm being serious." "I know you are," I said, still smiling. "And that's what makes it funny." He leaned back, annoyed now. "If you find this so amusing, maybe you'd prefer to leave. We can formalize that today." I looked him square in the eye. "Then fire me." His expression faltered, just for a second. "Excuse me?" I leaned forward this time. "Fire me. If I'm so useless, let's not waste time. Get HR in here and walk me out." The room was silent. I could see his confusion starting to bloom. He hadn't expected defiance. Not from me. He thought I'd beg. Just like the others. But I had something he didn't know. And how fun the next boardroom meeting would be. Because he had no idea who actually held the power in this company. No idea whose signature was needed to approve his next promotion. Or his quiet removal. That day, as I walked out of the conference room with a polite nod, I wasn't furious. I was ready. Ready for the curtain to lift and ready to finally show Jacob Moore exactly who he had just tried to erase. By the time Friday rolled around, word had started to spread. Not publicly, of course, but in offices like this, whispers move faster than emails. People noticed the way I left the conference room. Calm, composed, not a trace of worry on my face. That's the thing about silence. It unnerves the loudest people the most. Jacob spent the morning in back-to-back meetings, walking through the halls like a man measuring his new kingdom. He didn't make eye contact. Not with me, not with anyone outside his hand-picked circle of junior executives. But I knew what he was doing, paving the way for something bigger. He had plans, ambitions, and in his mind I was a loose end. Someone to be tied off before the board's quarterly strategy session. Too bad he hadn't done his homework. That morning, I got a call from Michelle, Colburn's head of legal and someone I'd trusted for years. "Linda," she said, "I reviewed the latest board prep file. Jacob submitted a proposed restructure plan. Your name's not in it." I raised an eyebrow. "He's trying to erase a whole division? Or just edge you out entirely?" But here's the part he really screwed up. He listed the majority shareholder approval as pending. I smiled. Of course he did. He doesn't know it's you, does he? Number and I have no plans to tell him. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Linda, you could stop this today." "I don't want to stop it," I replied. "I want him to walk right into it." Because the truth is, men like Jacob don't learn through words. They learn through consequences. And his was coming. I spent the afternoon preparing my notes for the board meeting, scheduled for Monday morning. I reviewed our financials, operational risks, and department performance. Then I pulled up my ownership documents, quietly reminding myself of the leverage I carried in a leather folder no one had seen. When I closed my laptop that evening, I felt the tension settle in my chest like a loaded spring. Monday would be interesting. But not for the reasons Jacob thought. Monday arrived with the kind of sharp winter sunlight that made everything feel a little too clear. I dressed intentionally. Not flashy. Just precise. Tailored navy blazer, clean white blouse, hair tied back, the look of someone you don't overlook twice. The boardroom was already half full when I arrived. Michelle caught my eye and gave a small nod. I took my seat near the far end of the table, my usual spot. Jacob walked in 10 minutes later, confidence radiating off him like heat. He took the seat to the right of the chairman, cleared his throat, and opened his presentation. "Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin with a vision. A leaner, more aggressive Colburn Tech. One that thrives by cutting through outdated practices and redefining leadership." His eyes scanned the room as he clicked through slides. Charts, buzzwords, projections, all tailored to impress. Then came the final section. In order to accelerate innovation, I propose a structural change to the analytics division. We'll transition Linda Geller's role to an external advisory position, with her duties redistributed to more agile junior staff. He said it without even glancing in my direction. A few board members shifted in their seats. Michelle stared at him, stone-faced. Then the chairman spoke. "Before we proceed, we need shareholder approval for any structural changes at that level." Jacob nodded. "I've listed it as pending. I was under the impression it wouldn't be a problem." It was time. I cleared my throat. Calmly. Clearly. "I'm afraid I can't approve that." Jacob blinked. "I'm sorry?" I said no. He turned toward me, confused. "With all due respect, Linda, you don't have the authority." "I do," I said, reaching into my folder. I placed a copy of the ownership structure on the table, sliding it toward the chairman. Michelle leaned forward and confirmed. "She does. Linda is the majority shareholder through Geller Holdings. It's been verified since the last capital raise." The silence was thunderous. Jacob stared at me, lips parting, then closing again. For the first time since he arrived, he looked unsure. I didn't know." I tilted my head. "That's exactly the problem, Jacob. You've been making sweeping decisions without understanding who you're dealing with. or what they've done for this company. The chairman leaned back in his chair. Well, that certainly changes things. Jacob turned red. Why didn't anyone tell me? I didn't flinch. Because you didn't ask. You assumed? He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Just silence. Heavy. Defeated. The chairman spoke again, this time to the room. We'll take a short recess. Linda, if you'd stay back for a moment. As the others filed out, Jacob remained frozen in his seat. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. His silence said enough. Because that morning, Jacob Moore finally realized the boardroom wasn't his kingdom. It was mine. And I was just getting started. After the boardroom cleared out, the silence felt different. Not the kind that comes from uncertainty, but the kind that follows a shift in gravity. The kind people notice but don't yet understand. I remained seated while the chairman reviewed the documents I'd handed him. His brows rose only slightly, but that was enough. So, this explains why you were so composed, he said quietly. I gave a small nod. I've spent a long time choosing when to speak. He folded his hands, thoughtful. You didn't have to stay quiet, Linda. You could have pulled rank at any time. I didn't want rank, I said. I wanted results. I wanted to see who showed up with integrity, and who tried to bulldoze their way through the people who built this place. He nodded slowly, then leaned back. I'll be honest, that was one hell of a power move. I wasn't aiming for drama, I replied. Just clarity. Outside the room, I could already hear murmurs returning, footsteps, shifting chairs. The others would be back soon. But Jacob hadn't moved. He was still seated at the table, staring at the screen in front of him like it might offer a lifeline. He hadn't said a word since I'd revealed the truth, and I hadn't looked at him once. When I stood, I gathered my folder, slid my pen into my notebook, and walked past his chair without pause. But just as I reached the door, I heard it. Why didn't you just tell me? His voice was quiet, flat, almost like a child who had just realized the game was real. I turned slightly, not enough to face him. Because the people who matter know, and the ones who don't, eventually show you why they don't. Then I left. The rest of the day moved like molasses. Emails piled up. Meetings were postponed. No one knew what to say, so most didn't say anything at all. But the atmosphere had changed. People passed me in the hallway with subtle nods, unsure if they were supposed to acknowledge what had happened. Some were curious, some looked relieved, and others looked worried. I wasn't surprised. Jacob didn't show up to the afternoon executive huddle. His assistant claimed he was handling urgent matters. I didn't need a memo to know what that meant. He was scrambling, trying to figure out how he'd missed something so critical, trying to dig himself out before the ground gave way completely. But the cracks were already showing. That evening, as I was preparing to leave, I received an anonymous message through our internal employee portal. Thank you. You don't know me, but I've watched him steamroll half my team these past few weeks. It means a lot to see someone finally stop him. There was no name, no department listed, just a quiet note of gratitude from someone who'd clearly been holding their breath for too long. It was the first of many. By Tuesday, 5 more messages came through. Then 12. Some were short, others long, detailed, filled with timelines of sudden dismissals, strange evaluations, veiled threats. I compiled everything into a private file, not for revenge, for proof. Because I knew Jacob. Men like him don't fold after one bad hand. They find a new deck, a new angle, and if he couldn't oust me directly, he'd try to undermine me indirectly, through whispers, metrics, division. Sure enough, it started with a memo, titled, Reevaluation of Departmental Efficiency. It came from Jacob's office late Wednesday, flagged for immediate review. It requested access to team performance data across the analytics and finance divisions. Subtle, strategic, designed to look like oversight but aimed like a weapon. I smiled. He was predictable. And that made him easy to outmaneuver. I picked up the phone and called Michelle. I think it's time we take this up a notch. I said. You want to initiate an internal audit? She asked. Number I want to meet with HR and compliance. Off the record. I'm not accusing anyone of misconduct. Yet. But I want a record of everything that's happened since Jacob arrived. There was a pause. Then, understood. That night, I stayed late again. Not because I had to, but because I needed to think. I walked the empty halls, the fluorescent lights humming above me, the city skyline glowing faintly through the floor-to-ceiling windows. 8 years. 8 years of building, supporting, fixing things quietly. And now finally, someone had tried to erase me, only to find out I owned the pen. But this wasn't over. I could feel it in the air. Jacob wasn't done. He was licking his wounds, waiting, plotting his next move. And whatever it was, I'd be ready. By the following Monday, Jacob was back in the office. He walked with that same overconfident stride, nodding to people like nothing had happened, like the board meeting hadn't exposed the single biggest oversight of his career. That was the thing about Jacob. His ego was both his armor and his blindfold. And now it was beginning to crack. But instead of challenging me directly, he shifted tactics. That week, I noticed small, subtle changes. First, it was the data permissions. My team suddenly lost access to 2 of the core reporting dashboards we'd used for years. When I contacted IT, they said the change came from an executive directive. Streamlining workflows, they called it. No one would admit whose directive, of course. But I didn't need to ask. Next came the client meeting shuffle. My scheduled presentation with our largest analytics partner was reassigned. I only found out when my calendar sent me a cancellation alert, 15 minutes before the meeting. When I followed up, Jacob's assistant said it had been rerouted to better align with operational leadership. I could feel it happening. He wasn't coming for my job anymore. He was coming for my credibility. It was slow, intentional, a quiet sabotage. He wanted the perception of my influence to erode, inch by inch. Not by confrontation, but by control. He was betting I'd get tired, that I'd get paranoid, lash out, or simply give up. But I'd seen this tactic before. Years ago, fresh out of business school, I'd worked under a manager who had done the exact same thing to a woman on our leadership team. Whisper campaigns, strategic exclusion, private criticisms masked as concerns. She eventually left, exhausted, isolated. I hadn't had the voice to speak up then, but I do now. That Wednesday, I asked Michelle to lunch. We met at a quiet place off campus, a small cafe with worn leather booths and dim lighting. I laid out the pattern, the access blocks, the reassignments, the tone of Jacob's new memos. He's isolating you, she said after a long sip of her coffee. Yes, I said. And I want to respond the right way. Not react. Respond. Michelle nodded. Start documenting everything. Not just incidents, emails, meeting logs, timestamps. If he's creating a hostile work environment, we need evidence. I already have a file, I said. And I've started getting quiet messages from others. People he's sidelined. People who are afraid to speak. She leaned in. How far are you willing to take this? I didn't answer immediately. Then, as far as I have to. I won't be pushed out of the company I helped save. Not by a man who walked in with a shiny resume and a superiority complex. Over the next few days, I became meticulous. I logged every delay, every denial of access, every meeting I was removed from. I kept screenshots, recorded call summaries, even voice memos when I left certain discussions. My inbox became a journal, my calendar, a map of microaggressions. Then something strange happened. I received a forwarded message, an email Jacob had sent to the chairman, CCing 2 board members. It had been accidentally sent to me by one of the recipients. A quiet ally, I suspected. The message was short, clinical. Linda has shown signs of disengagement. I'm concerned about her leadership viability long term. She's missed several meetings and seems increasingly uncooperative. I stared at the screen. Disengaged. Uncooperative. Words used not to describe, but to erase. This was it. His next move. He wasn't just sabotaging workflow. He was creating a narrative. One where I was the problem. One where he could push for my removal not with malice, but with plausible deniability. I took a deep breath and flagged the email. This time, I wouldn't stay quiet. The next morning, I called for a closed-door meeting with the chairman and Michelle. I presented my file. Calmly, cleanly, without emotion. Just facts, dates, patterns, evidence. When I finished, the room was silent. Then Michelle spoke. This is coordinated, calculated, and it's not just you. It's company resources being manipulated to undermine a senior executive. The chairman folded his hands. You've handled this with impressive restraint, Linda. I met his eyes. I didn't come to burn bridges, but I won't let someone slowly torch my reputation just to protect their own ego. He nodded. Leave it with us. There's a board ethics committee meeting next week. Jacob will be invited to present his leadership case. Will I be allowed to attend? You won't just attend, he said. You'll speak. As I left the room, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Certainty. Jacob had underestimated me once. That had been his first mistake. Now he was trying to rewrite the story. And next week, I'd make sure the board knew the truth. In my own words. Because I wasn't just a shareholder or a department head. I was the warning he never heard coming. The board ethics meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at 9 a.m. I arrived 10 minutes early. Not because I was nervous, but because I wanted them to see I wasn't hiding. The executive conference room was unusually still. No chatter, no light jokes, just silence, broken only by the quiet clicking of laptops and the occasional sip of coffee. Michelle met me outside the glass door. Are you ready for this? She asked. I nodded once. I've been ready since the day he tried to erase me. Inside, the board members were already seated. The chairman, the CFO, 2 senior advisors, and the company's external HR counsel. At the head of the table sat an empty chair. For Jacob. He arrived at exactly 8:59. Still polished, still smug. But this time, his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Good morning, he said, voice smooth. Appreciate everyone being here. The chairman nodded. Jacob, you've been invited to respond to several internal concerns raised about your leadership conduct over the last 6 weeks. You'll have time to present your perspective. Then we'll hear from Linda. Jacob gave me a tight glance, as if this were just another performance to get through. He opened his folder, cleared his throat, and began. I believe what we're dealing with is a simple matter of operational misalignment. I was brought in to optimize performance. Unfortunately, some individuals have taken strategic decisions personally, particularly those involving role realignment and departmental efficiency. He spoke like a textbook. Cold. Rehearsed. Linda Geller has been an asset to this company. But over the past month, her behavior has changed. She's withdrawn from key projects, resisted collaborative input, and, frankly, created an atmosphere of tension that's been reported by several colleagues. He paused to let the words settle. A subtle smear, dressed in professionalism. He continued. While I regret that our relationship has become strained, I believe this is less about misconduct and more about a clash of working styles. I'd like to move past it. Focus on solutions. When he finished, the room was still. He leaned back slightly, pleased with his delivery. Then it was my turn. I didn't stand. I didn't raise my voice. I simply opened my own folder. I'd like to clarify a few things, I said, looking at each board member one by one. The decisions Jacob refers to weren't strategic. They were targeted. I've documented 6 separate instances where I was intentionally removed from meetings, stripped of data access, and reassigned from client communications without cause. I handed printed copies of the timeline to everyone at the table. Michelle nodded as I continued. These weren't performance-based decisions. They were deliberate moves to push me out, to isolate me. After I revealed I was the majority shareholder, the tone changed. Subtly at first. Then systematically. I paused. And I'm not the only one. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a second folder. Inside were the anonymous reports I had received from employees across multiple departments, each one recounting similar tactics: gaslighting, exclusion, demeaning evaluations with no basis in fact. The same pattern appears in every story: abrupt restructuring, no transparency, no support, just quiet pressure to leave. The chairman glanced through the reports, his face tight. Additionally, I said, I received a copy of an email Jacob sent to the board stating I had disengaged from my duties. That email was based on meetings I had been removed from without my knowledge. He created the absence, then used it as evidence. I let the silence do the rest. Jacob's composure faltered. These are one-sided accounts, he said quickly. You can't take anonymous complaints as fact. Michelle spoke up then, calm, firm. Actually, we've corroborated several of the events Linda documented. IET confirmed the access removals came directly from your office. HR has flagged similar concerns raised internally, ones that were never followed up. The chairman folded his hands. Jacob, he said, your role here was to lead with integrity. Instead, you created an environment of manipulation and fear. You misused your authority, and now the board has to decide what that means for your future here. Jacob looked at me, his voice rising for the first time. This is a setup. You all let her trap me. No, I interrupted, calm as ever. You trapped yourself. You underestimated the one person who wouldn't stay quiet. There was a pause. Then the chairman stood. Jacob, you are suspended effective immediately pending further review. Security will escort you out after this meeting. We'll be issuing a formal statement to the executive team by end of day. Jacob stood, stunned. His face, once smug, had collapsed into something I'd never seen from him before. Disbelief. I built this, he started. No, I said softly. You nearly destroyed it. He turned and left the room without another word. As the door clicked shut behind him, the room exhaled. The chairman looked at me. You didn't just protect yourself, Linda. You protected this company. I nodded but didn't smile, because I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. 2 weeks after Jacob was escorted out of the building, the atmosphere at Colburn Tech had changed. Not with fanfare or celebration. There were no emails praising justice, no office-wide announcements. But the silence itself felt different now. No longer heavy with suspicion, but open. Light. People made eye contact again. Laughter returned to break rooms. Meetings started to feel like actual collaboration, not battles of posturing and control. Still, Jacob's shadow lingered. Rumors flew that he'd tried to negotiate a quiet exit with a severance package, but the board declined. The formal report cited abuse of authority, ethical violations, and an attempt to deliberately mislead executive leadership. He left without an official statement. No LinkedIn update, no goodbye drinks. He just vanished. And I didn't step into the spotlight immediately. Instead, I went back to work. But this time, things were different. The board asked me to stay on as interim head of strategic operations. I accepted, but on one condition. I want to rebuild trust, I told the chairman. Not just mine, everyone's. He agreed. We need that now more than ever. So I started small. I met with every department head personally. I reopened channels Jacob had shut down. I reinstated access to the teams who'd been cut out of their own workflows. I invited anonymous feedback. I asked questions. And most importantly, I listened. The messages kept coming too, from people I'd never spoken to before. One junior analyst wrote, "When I saw you speak in that meeting, I realized I didn't have to be afraid to speak up anymore. Thank you for showing me that strength doesn't always mean yelling. Another message simply said, you made me believe we could be led by someone who actually sees us. Those words stayed with me, because that's what it had all come down to in the end. Being seen. A month after Jacob's removal, the board gathered again. This time, not for discipline, but for decision. The chairman called me into his office ahead of the meeting. I assumed it was to discuss a new appointment, maybe even help choose Jacob's permanent replacement. Instead, he slid an envelope across his desk. My name was printed in gold on the front. I opened it slowly. Inside was a formal letter, stamped and signed. Permanent Executive Director of Strategic Operations. I looked up. I didn't ask for this, I said, barely above a whisper. I know, he replied, and that's why you're the right choice. There was no triumphant music, no round of applause. Just stillness. I nodded once. If I take this, I want a seat at every strategic table, not just for optics, but to drive change. You have it. And I want a new code of leadership conduct, non-negotiable. Every new hire, every promotion. We start from values. Done. And the people Jacob tried to bury. I want their voices amplified. No more silencing talent because it's inconvenient. You're shaping the culture now, he said. We're just following your lead. That night, I stayed in the office long after everyone had gone home. I stood by the window, looking out at the city, its lights flickering like stars trying to stay lit in fog. I thought about my first day here, 8 years ago. I'd sat quietly at my desk, terrified to speak too loudly, afraid to make mistakes. I'd watched others rise by noise and proximity, while I kept my head down, working, waiting. I used to wonder if anyone ever noticed. Now I know they did. Eventually. The next morning, I removed Jacob's old nameplate from the glass wall of his former office. I didn't replace it with mine. Instead, I had a new one made. Integrity is not optional. 3 words, but everyone understood what they meant. Because leadership isn't about control. It's about clarity, respect, responsibility. And the people you lead will never forget how you made them feel. I know now that power doesn't always look like shouting in meetings or pounding fists on tables. Sometimes it looks like a woman quietly sitting through an ambush, then walking out stronger. Sometimes it's knowing when to speak, and sometimes it's knowing when to let silence speak for you. I didn't win because I had the title. I won because I never lost sight of who I was, even when others tried to rewrite the story. And that's a kind of power no one can take from you.